Welcome, everybody. Tonight, class is going to be on the basics of maintaining your bicycle brakes. We're going to do a little bit of anatomy of brakes. Before we jump into tonight's content, I would just love to know who is out there, and I would just ask if you could say your name, how it is pronounced. Your first name is fine. And then how you heard about this class, and I will introduce myself first. So my name is India. I've been teaching the basics of bike maintenance in the Madison community for 17 years, and it's a lot of fun. This is my second virtual class, and I think like everybody else, we're just kind of doing the best we can with what we have. Dar, who's the co-host of this session, actually took one of my very first courses and has been a supporter ever since. And so I'm thankful with gratitude to Dar for inviting me to teach these classes. So we can just go in the order that I see people. I'm just going to call out the name. If I mispronounce it, you can unmute yourself and then tell me how it is pronounced, and then just answer that, your name and how you heard about the class. So we'll start with what looks like maybe Elisa.
Hi, it's Alyssa. And I think I just saw an email about it. I think I must be on the Bicycle Resource Center list, so I think I heard about it that way.
Great. Okay. And next we have Anne, or Anne-Marie. And you have to. Yep.
Okay, Anne-Marie, and I've been to another one of your classes, and I'm on your email list.
Great. Welcome. And next, Atharva.
Yeah, Atharva, and the same as Alyssa and Anne.
Excellent. And Danette.
Yep, my name is Danette, and I've seen the information. I can't remember. I was looking for resources in the Madison area, and I want to say it was on the UW-Madison something.
Great. Awesome. And Irene?
Hi, I pronounced my name Irene.
Oh,
I also go by Irene, and I think I'm also on your email list.
Great.
And I wanted to attend the last session, but I couldn't do it, so I'm here for the break session.
Excellent. Well, I think the last session was recorded, and at some point, Dar will send out information on how you can access that class.
Yeah, that would be awesome if I can see the recording. Thank you.
You're welcome. Welcome. And JJ. JJ is there. Okay.
There we go.
Hi.
Sorry.
That's
yeah,
okay.
You had me muted, so I couldn't get undone. So I'm JJ. I think I'm in like 12 different bicycle lists, so I don't know which one popped this.
Sure.
So.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad you made it here tonight in this virtual space together. So I'm going to just start with the anatomy of the braking system on bikes. What we're going to cover tonight, well, I guess before we get started, does anybody have any sort of questions that they just can't wait to get answered? And if you do, go ahead and how do you want to do that, Dar? Raise their hand? Is there a way to do that, and Dar can call on you?
I think they can just unmute themselves and speak up and negotiate it. There's not that many people.
Yep. So go ahead. If anybody has a question that they want me to try to answer before we jump into the content, now is a good time. But this is not the only time that you'll be able to do this. I'll wait about 5 seconds. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to start with is the anatomy of the braking system, just so that we're all using the same terms and lingo, and that we all are talking about the same thing and sort of understand the different parts of the braking system. Tonight we are going to cover rim brakes, which is the most common type of brakes that are on bicycles, but certainly not the only types of brakes. So just for example, there are coaster brakes, which are the kind that when you pedal backwards, you make the bike stop. There are blanking on the disc brakes, which you squeeze with your hands just like rim brakes, but the brake pads squeeze something different than the rim. And there's some other kinds of brakes on bikes that I'm not going to have the time or take the time to cover. Rim brakes are by far the most common, and if you get the sort of idea behind how rim brakes work, you can then use that information to figure out how other braking systems work. So the kind of basic parts of a braking system, this is a fabricated model that is not, obviously not a real bicycle. And this is to mimic the handlebars and then the brakes, and usually they're not this close together. So on this system that I have in front of me, this is just one side. This is my right hand, but maybe your left hand. So generally on bikes, not all bikes, but most bikes, the brakes are set up so that when you squeeze with your right hand, which is going to look the opposite for you on the computer, when you squeeze with your right hand when you're riding the bicycle, that is generally going to activate your rear brakes. And when you squeeze with your left hand, that is generally going to activate your front brakes. And so this system is slightly different just for the sake of having an example, but it gets the point across. So what this has is a facsimile handlebar, which is just a place where the brake, the brake lever, jump in, brake lever, thank you, where the brake lever can attach onto the handlebars. There's a clamp with the nut and a bolt. So there's a clamp with a nut and a bolt. So this is the clamping system. I have my hand wrapped around the clamping system, and then there's a bolt that goes in and clamps the brake lever to the handlebars. Then the brake lever, when you're squeezing the brake lever, what you're really doing is pulling on, let me get in there, the head of a cable, which is right here. And so the head of the cable, that's one end of the brake cable. And so what that looks like when it's not inside of a brake lever is it looks like that. It's the head. And it just gets caught in the brake lever so it can't pull through. That's what the head is for. So that the brake cable is being held in place by the brake lever. And then the brake lever just simply provides extra leverage so that you can yank on the brake cable with sufficient force to activate the brakes. And so what that looks like is then there is a piece of cable housing which goes from the brake lever here. And if we follow it, it goes down through this little metal casing and down into this cable anchor pinch bolt. And the cable anchor pinch bolt does what the name of it says it does. Sorry, everything is like in reverse for me. I'm learning how to do this. So the cable anchor pinch bolt is right here, and it's a bolt that literally crimps and clamps the other end of the cable in place. And then there's a little bit of cable sticking out here And this is so that if you were to undo the cable anchor pinch bolt, you could then have something to hold on to and tighten or loosen the brake cable in a large brake adjustment or when you're putting a new cable on. And what this is here is just a piece of metal, like a little metal helmet that's been slid on and then crimped with a tool so that the cable doesn't fray, which, okay. And then on this type of brakes, and there are several different types of rim brakes, and we'll look at some, but not all of them tonight. But this is, these are sort of like, they're called V brakes, and they attempt to have the brake pads, which are right here, and the brake pads are made out of rubber and metal, and we're going to look at them a little bit more closely in detail after we're done looking at the whole system. But then the brake pads pinch onto the rim when I pull on the cable, and if this assembly was actually working the way that it's supposed to, if there was a wheel in there, it would be clamping onto the rim, which would be where my finger is right now. That's part of the story. The other part of the story is that in addition to the cable, there's also a spring. In each braking system, there's a cable and a spring. So this happens to be the arm of a spring in this brake assembly. And the spring part, which sometimes looks like this is a little bit easier to tell that it's a spring, which you could maybe see that if you were to coil this spring a little bit tighter, it would want to uncoil, which is what's happening when I push on this springy arm. It's coiling a spring that looks just like this. That's housed right in there. Housed right in there. And this is a spring that's inside of a housing, so you wouldn't see the spring once it was attached to the brake assembly. Not all springs have this arm, but this arm is just a nice place where it can get tucked onto the brake arm. And that's how this, so when you pull on the brake lever, you're pulling the brake pads in towards the rim. And when you let go of the brake lever, the cable isn't going to push. So that's sort of lesson number one for tonight, is something that they teach in, I think maybe like the first day of an engineering class, is a cable or a rope is great for doing work. If you hold on to one end of it and then another end of it, you can pull on it and make the other end move. But if you push on it, the other end doesn't care. So you can't push on a rope to make it do work. You can only pull on a rope or a cable to make it do work. So the point there is that if I only had a cable to make my brakes work, I would be able to pull the brake pads in towards the rim, but they wouldn't unclamp on their own. And that's what the spring does. And so I'm just going to pick up a different brake assembly and show you the same parts. So on this brake assembly, here's the pretend handlebar that the brake lever can clamp onto, the brake lever, which is pulling on the head of the cable, which is right here, pulling on that. When I pull on that, the cable is traveling through this piece of housing. We're going to talk about housing more because it's more important than it looks. That cable travels down and then gets attached on one end to the brake assembly with a quick release fit. And on the other end, you see the cable anchor pinch bolt right here. And then the end with the crimp on it. And so that pulls when you pull on the cable, you're pulling the brake pads in towards the rim. It's a geometric setup that makes it so that as you pull the lever this way, it pulls the cable then this way, which then pulls the brake pads this way. And then the springs are housed in something that looks just like this and go right here on this type of brake. We'll look at another type of brake in a few minutes, but now we're going to talk about cables and housing a little bit. Before I jump into cables and housing, any questions about what I've said so far? Okay. If there are questions at any point, please just pepper them out at me. So this is a piece of, I'm just going to unwind it. This is a piece of brake cable. It has two ends. One end is the end that gets caught in the brake lever and gets held in place and that you end up pulling on. And the other end gets pinched by the cable anchor pinch bolt and acts as the other functional end. And what this piece of cable is trying to show, if we can get the camera resolution, is that get my head out of the way, is that cables are brake cables, bicycle brake cables and bicycle shift cables, which are slightly different but have the same type of construction, are made up of single strands of wire that are twisted together. And so if I were to twist this all together, it would look more like a cable again. And then, over this way. Okay, and then when I untwist it, you can see the single strands. And the point of me showing you this is that the fact that it's a whole bunch of strands wound together is what makes the cable flexible and strong. So this cable is really hard to cut or break, which is good because you want it to be stopping you. So you can imagine it's being pinched on one end and pulled on the other, and you certainly don't want it to break in the middle. So brake cables are really strong and really flexible. And the reason they need to be flexible is because when you're on your bicycle, see if there's a better example of this. When you're on your bicycle, oftentimes the cable has to go from, and this is just on like a front brake assembly, the cable has to go from the brake lever inside here, winding around along the handlebars down to the front brakes. And you can imagine the rear brake cable has to traverse the whole length of the bicycle and then get to your rear brakes, and it has to take a number of bends in order to reach the brake assembly that you're trying to activate. And so there are different brake cable heads for different styles of brakes. So the first couple brakes that we looked at had like flat bars or straight bars. So this would be more for a mountain bike, a hybrid, a cruiser, that type of bike. Would have maybe flat handlebars or flat-ish handlebars, and it would have brake levers that follow the profile of the bar, so you can grab them comfortably. And so the head of the cable fits in there, right there, and looks like that. And that's one style of brake cable head. And then for the road bike brake, let's see if I can, it's going to be a little harder to see. In person, it's a little easier. I'm going to get something to point with. You might have to take my word for it, but in this brake assembly, right in here where I'm pointing, that's actually the head of a cable. And what you're seeing in profile, it looks like so, but the way that you were seeing it in the bike was like this in that brake assembly. So this is just a different style of brake cable head that is more common on road bikes or bikes that have those drop handlebars that then have the brake levers that follow the profile of the curved bars, and they just have a different style of brake cable. A lot of bike stuff is sort of traditional, the way it's been built forever and the way it doesn't change unless it needs to. Cables, that's the cable end of things. And then we'll look at housing briefly, and then we're going to get back to housing toward the later in the class. So this is a piece of brake housing. It is plastic on the outside, plasticky rubbery plastic on the outside, and then I've cut away a little bit of it. I'm just trying to get the camera focused in, so that you can see there's metal on the inside, and it's a straw. So it's a metal straw that the cable goes through. So it looks like that, metal straw, and then coated with plasticky, rubbery plastic. So the point of housing is that what housing does is it protects the cable from the elements. That's sort of its and it's aesthetic. It's that's sort of its mundane job. And then the job that it does that most people don't recognize is that what the housing allows, it's like a piece of hose or a straw, and it allows the cable to follow a curved path while still being tight. So I'm going to say that again because that's actually important. It allows the cable to follow a curved path while still being held taut from end to end. So if this is not in a piece of housing and I were to pull it tight, it's going to go straight from point to point. There's no way I can have it curved and tight at the same time. A cable needs to be tight in order to do work. So if I want to pull on the head of this cable and make this end move, when I pull, I have to first pull it taut before this end's going to go anywhere to follow it. So if this cable was on a bicycle, it wouldn't do much good for brakes if I had to first pull out the whole sort of length of cable before I could get the brakes to work. So the housing can provide a curved path because the housing, if you think back or remember back to a minute or two ago when I said that it was metal inside of plastic, the housing goes from here to here, and when I pull on the cable through the housing, I can pull it from one end to the other, and it's going through this curved path, but it's taut all the way through there, being pinched here and held in the lever here. So that comes into play when we're trying to tighten or loosen our cables to adjust them in order to make adjustments on our brakes. The housing is actually doing a big job for us. Okay, next. So brakes are a part of the bicycle that need sort of routine maintenance and they wear out. So brake pads, which look sometimes something like this. So a brake shoe or a brake pad are interchangeable terms. They mean the same thing, and they're this part here. And oftentimes they're on a post in order to attach to the bicycle. So brake pads wear out over time because the friction of the brake pad rubbing on the rim in order to stop the bicycle wears away the brake pad. And what happens over time is a brake pad will go from, they start at different thicknesses, but a brake pad will start out sort of thick and it will wear to thinner. And I think I'm going to say all. I'm going to go out on a limb and say all. I try not to say that too often because there's usually an exception to the rule. But all the brake pads that I know of have grooves in them. And the grooves have two different functions. One is that they serve to, as the brake pad is clamping onto the rim, the grooves allow, if there's any dirt or water that's on the rim, it allows that to get out so that you can have friction between the brake pad and the rim. So it serves as a channel to get rid of dirt or water that's on the rim to make sure that your brake pad's going to work in the rain or through mucky conditions. And then the second separate function of those grooves is that they serve as wear indicators, like tread on a tire. I think most people are familiar, some people are familiar with tread on a car tire being used as a wear indicator, so that once the tread on this brake pad recedes and you don't see it any longer, it's time to replace that brake pad. So brake pads wear over time and do need to be replaced. People love to ask the question, how often should I replace my brake pads? And there's no firm answer on that. So the answer is once they're worn out, which is similar to how often should I replace my shoes? Well, if you have your bike hung up in your garage most of the season and you ride it a few times, it could take many years before your brake pads wear out. Whereas if you ride through one Wisconsin winter with grime and grit and salt and doing a lot of braking, you might wear them out in one season. So the answer is between those two extremes usually. But there's no set amount of time that a brake pad lasts. It wears out when it's being used. So that's a good thing. So the more you use your brakes, the quicker they're going to wear out. Brake pads. So over time, the surface of the brake pad wears away, but it can also wear in different ways. So as the brake is squeezing onto the rim, what can happen, and next time I'll have a wheel with me, but basically, so my finger is going to stand in for the bike, for the rim today. So if my finger is the rim and this pad is hitting the rim, what you ideally want on your bicycle is for the brake pad to hit the rim squarely and get nice even braking. If the brake pad is tipped one way or the other, without my finger being tipped, I'll make it like real obvious. If the brake pad is tipped, it's only going to wear away where it's contacting the rim. If the brake pad is lower down than my finger and the rim, it's only going to wear out. So if the brake pad is, let's see if we can go this way. If the brake pad is lower down, only the top of the brake pad is going to wear away. If the brake pad is too high, only the bottom of the brake pad is going to wear away, and the brake pad's also going to be hitting the rubber of the bicycle tire, and it will eventually cause a abrasion in the bicycle tire. So the placement of the brake pad on the rim is actually pretty important and something that can be visually checked. So if you have a bicycle or you have a friend's bicycle or you know of a bicycle who's your friend, you can go to that bicycle, not right this minute, but at your leisure, the next time you're with your bicycle, you can go to it and you can squeeze on the brakes. You can check the front and then check the rear, and you can look and see, are the, hello, welcome, are the brake pads hitting the rim squarely? And if they are, great. And if not, that's something that can be adjusted. And I'll talk a little bit more in a little while about different ways to adjust the placement of your brake pads. But right now, I just want to see if I can show you this brake pad. It's not terribly in focus, but what I'm trying to show you is that this brake pad, it just does the opposite, is worn out more on the top than on the bottom, and there's a little lip on the bottom, and that's not an uncommon thing to have happen. And the reason is that trying to find the best example of this. So brake pads travel in toward the rim on pivots. And so sometimes they are pivoting, like on this model, these are the pivot points here. And when I pull on the brake pads are coming in and down onto the rim. And on this model, the pivot points are up here. And when I pull on the brake pad, the brakes are actually coming in and up onto the rim, which is fine. So they're set up to do that, and they're going to be adjusted to take that into account. But what happens over time, as the surface of the brake pad wears, what happens is then you get more and more space as the brake pad becomes farther and farther away from the rim because the surface of the brake pad is being worn away. And now the brake pad has to travel further on its arc, whether that arc was coming down and in or up and in. The brake pad has to travel further on that arc in order to reach the rim. So for example, if it's a brake pad that's going down and into the rim, it's going to go down further before it hits the rim because it's going further along that arc. And what you're going to have is a brake pad that hits the rim farther down and eventually becomes out of adjustment, and only the top portion of the brake pad is going to hit the rim, and the result would be a little lip on the bottom of the brake pad, which you may or may not be able to see right here. And what happens, this is just sort of a interesting side note, is when there's a big lip on the bottom, created on the bottom of a brake pad, it actually it's molded to the rim. And as you pull on the rim, I don't know if anybody has experienced this, let me know. It's not uncommon, but it's uncommon enough that most people won't experience it, but it's not uncommon either. If you work in a bike shop, it's not uncommon to see that it come in, is that when somebody will pull on their brakes, for example, let's just say the rear brakes, and they are chiseled away in that way by friction, the brakes will clamp onto the rim, and the spring will not be able to bring them back away from the rim, and the brakes will just stay clamped onto the rim. And that's a brake issue that bike mechanics see from time to time, is someone will come in and say, I hit my brakes, and then they just locked in and they wouldn't come off. And I would say almost always the reason is because there's this very sort of sharp lip at the bottom that matches exactly the profile of the rim, because that's what's carved it away. And the result is a brake that doesn't work anymore. And so the fix for that is, if the brake pad is sufficiently worn out, you would just replace the brake pad. If the brake pad is only minorly worn out, what you could do, and this is maybe a better example of that, you can see there's this lip down here of brake pad that, can you see that? I don't know. But that's what that is. I'm trying to get it like in the light. That right there. So that's one issue that can happen. Another common issue that people tend to, it's more common, is brakes that make noise or squeal. And there's sort of two different reasons why. There's one reason why it happens. The reason why it happens is because as the brakes are hitting the rim, for one reason or another, they are vibrating at a high frequency, and that frequency matches a pitch that we can hear. So that's what squealing brakes are. But there are a couple reasons why that symptom would manifest when you're biking. And so the main reason is that earlier I had said that you want the brake pad to be hitting the rim. No, other way. Hitting the rim really squarely, like not tilted, not cocked this way or that way, and hitting the rim really squarely. But in reality, you actually want the rim, the brake pad, to be hitting the wheel as it makes contact. You want the very front of the brake pad to contact the wheel before the back of the brake pad. And what that does is, so the wheel, the motion of the wheel, if I'm riding the bicycle, is always in the forward direction. You might wheel your bike backwards to get it somewhere, but you're not ever riding it backwards. So you're always riding it forward, so the direction of the wheel is always unidirectional, which is always forward when you're riding a bicycle. And what happens when you're riding a bike, and if the brake is hitting the back first or even just square on, it, as this goes by, it shatters and it squeals. And if it hits front first, as the wheel goes by, it sucks it in onto the rim and hits really squarely as the bike is rotating forward. So that is there's a term associated with that. It's called towing of the brakes. And the way that I like to remember that is if you walk with your feet pointed in, like toed in. So you want the brake to be toed in just slightly. So I'm very much exaggerating when I'm doing this. The amount, if you can imagine, if you had something like a credit card and you were to slip that in the back half of the brake pad when it is contacting the rim, that would be about the correct amount of towing that you'd want in your adjustment of the brake on the rim. So does anybody have any experience with their brakes squealing? I have. If nobody else has, I have. I have had brakes that have squealed because they were not towed in correctly. I have also had brakes that squealed just because they are sometimes when braking surfaces get wet, they also tend to, for whatever reason, they tend to chatter. And so I have a bike that whenever it rains, I get a high-pitched squeal from my brakes. Excuse me. And I tend to see that as a feature because I can't fix it. And so I feel like when it rains and I hit my brakes hard, everybody can hear it and everybody knows to get out of my way. So that's my sort of lighthearted story about squealing brakes. Brake pads squealing. Trying to think of what to do next. Okay, so one way of maintaining and adjusting your brakes is adjusting the placement of the brake pad on the rim. And that differs depending on the style of brakes that you have. So for this brake, there is a clamp mechanism right here that's holding. This brake has a post that's inserted into the brake, and then there's a nut and bolt clamp that's holding that post in place. And so if I were to loosen this nut and bolt clamp, it would make it so that I could adjust the brake pad position in 3 dimensions. I could adjust it this way, I could adjust it this way, and I could adjust it this way. And so that is that style of brake pad. And then this is a sort of typical road style brake, and it's much easier to adjust than the other. It doesn't have as many ways that it can move. So this is a brake pad. It doesn't have the long post. It just has a short little post that goes through the brake arm, and then there's a nut on the end that or a bolt that goes in and holds it in place. And when you loosen that bolt, you can adjust it up and down, because there's a slot here that you can move it up and down in, and then you can also move it this way. But you don't get to do this type of motion, and you don't get to do much of this type of motion at all either, which makes it so that there's actually a special tool that if we were in the shop, I would be able to show you, but I don't have it home. But it is a funny bike tool, very specialized and very crude. It is a brake towing tool, and what it does is it's just a metal lever arm with a handle with this would be a metal U-shaped bit that snugly fits on here. And then with the lever arm, I could literally bend this brake arm, just cranking this tool. I would be doing this or this in order to get the correct towing on the rim. So I would usually end up cranking it a little bit to get the towing. So that's how that adjustment is made, and that's usually kind of a one and done adjustment. It's pretty fun to do because you sort of feel like you're being naughty, like you're not supposed to do that, but you are supposed to do that. So that's sort of typical road bike brake adjustments, brake pad adjustments, I should say. And then since we're on brake pads, I guess I'll go to the next thing that you can do with your brake pad. So the surface of the brake pad, when it starts out, I think this kind of captures it. Excuse me, it has sort of a matte finish to it. This is a brake pad that's never seen, it's never been used, so it's never been worn away. And what will happen over time is as this friction against the rim, the brake pad heats up because of the friction, and it melts just a little bit. And so part of it gets worn away, and part of it gets melted, and it's something that we call glazing. I'm trying to see if I have a good example of glazing. Yeah, maybe. I don't know if it'll show up on the camera, but we'll see. And so what happens, this doesn't really look shiny. Well, maybe. This has like a shinier sheen to it. It doesn't right here. But it does up here. And that part has been what we call sort of glazed and shiny. And that won't stop as well. That won't grip onto the rim as well once it's become shiny and glazed like that. And there's an easy way to fix that. So on your bicycle, I cannot predict exactly how, and you either will know or won't know how to undo the quick release of or take your wheel off. And sometimes just undoing the quick release of the brake makes it so that, so on this style of brake, I was able to do that, and then it makes it so that I have access to the brake pad surface. Other times when I undo the quick release for the brake mechanism, and what the quick release for the brake mechanism does is it spreads the brake pads apart enough so that when there's air in the tire, because the brake pads are sitting pretty close to the rim, that the tire can then slip through the brake pads to come out to remove the wheel. So this quick release lever spreads the brake pads apart a little bit, but not really enough so that if the wheel was in here that I could have access to the braking surface. So on this style of quick release with brakes, I would probably need to take the whole wheel out. And that's material for another class. But if you can do that, or if you can get help doing that, or if you can figure out how to do that, then what you can do once you have access to your brake pad surface is you can get yourself a sheet of emery cloth. Emery cloth is just like sandpaper, except that instead of a paper backing, it's a cloth backing. So it's sturdier and doesn't just disintegrate when you use it on a non-wooden surface. So what I've done is, it's easy to tear. So you could take a strip of a nice sheet. They come in sheets like a sheet of sandpaper, and you can get it emery cloth at a home hardware store or a home improvement store, and perhaps on the internet these days, I suppose. But you can rip the emery cloth, and you could rip a strip off. And so that's what this is a strip of emery cloth. In a bike shop, oftentimes a bike mechanic will use a coarse metal file. So if you happen to have a coarse metal file that you don't feel protective of at home, it's kind of rare, I think, for people to have that on hand. That can be used many times, and you can use that to clean up a brake pad and take the glazed surface off. But if you don't have a coarse metal file, then you can get yourself some emery cloth and rip off a strip. And then when you have opened up your brakes sufficiently with the quick release mechanism and or taken the wheel out to get access to the brake pad surface, then you can just simply take the emery cloth and rough up. I want to save that. So I'm going to do it to something that, do it to this one. So it looks like, this one looks like this right now, which may or may not mean anything on the camera, but what I'm doing is literally just buffing, like roughing up the surface. And you want to do this not over your computer like I am. You want to do this somewhere where you don't mind bits of dark rubber, kind of dirty rubber falling down onto the ground or onto the newspaper or paper bag that you've set down that you're doing this over. So you're scuffing that up and making it so it's a nice, let's try to do it over my rug. And I'm going to get most of it. Good enough. So that it's a more, and it's quite dirty. I missed a spot. There's like a little groove that I can't quite get to right now without wasting or spending more time doing it. But I've scuffed up the surface of this brake pad, and now it's nice and sort of fresh and ready to go and it has a lot of life left in it because the grooves are you can see them. Brake pads come in different profiles for different brake styles and rims. So they won't all be this thick. So if you go and look at your bike tonight or tomorrow or sometime soon, and you notice that the profile of your brake pad is much thinner, you don't have to worry about it. That's normal. There are long, thin brake pads, short, squat brake pads, ones that are kind of in the middle, and really using the grooves in them as your wear indicator rather than just visually. Because if you didn't look at them when they were new, you might not know how thick they're supposed to be. But you can note that the next time that you get new brake pads. So something that I mentioned earlier but forgot to talk about yet is that brake pads are not just rubber on a post. That's what they look like. That's what you see. So you're going to see a metal post where the brake pad attaches to the brake assembly, and then you're going to see the rubber cover of the brake pad, because that's the part that grabs onto the rim and causes friction and stops you stops the wheel from moving. But the brake pad actually has a metal plate in it. And the reason why it has a metal plate in it is for rigidity and strength. So if it was just a piece of rubber, when it gripped onto the rim, it would just sort of flop around and you wouldn't get that great stopping power that you get. So there's actually a metal plate in there, and this brake pad has a wear indicator. There's a little piece of metal that sticks out a little bit further than the rest of the metal plate, that once you hit that little metal nub, what you'll probably hear something similar to In a car, if your car brakes start squealing, often that is a wear indicator. It's a piece of metal that's been put in that will make it squeal so that you don't get to the point where you are have gone beyond the limit of your brakes and ruined them beyond repair. And so not all brake pads have that, but they do have the grooves as the wear indicator. And so once the grooves are completely gone, eventually you would start to hit metal. And what you don't want, and I've never seen anybody, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I've never seen anybody wear their brake pads out and then keep going to the point where they're just metal on metal, because I think that would become sort of obvious and your brakes would not work well for a while before that happened. Another thing other than glazing that can happen, and I'm not sure that the camera is going to, yeah, it kind of does, is going to capture this in any sort of like meaningful way, but what you're seeing right here, this little shiny bit, is actually a little piece of metal that's been embedded from the outside, not on purpose, into the brake pad. There are pieces of metal on the roadside, little bits of your rim can fleck off, and those can get embedded into the brake pad surface. Anything that gets embedded into the brake pad surface is just going to sit there, and then that in turn is going to wear away your rim surface. So at the same time that if you were going to be doing a visual inspection of your brake pad surface for glazing to see if you need to scuff it up with some somewhat coarse emery cloth, you could also inspect it just to see if there are any little bits of metal embedded in there. And if there are, then what you need to do is find yourself a tool to get them out. So a metal toothpick would work really well, something like that where you can just kind of get in there and get any little piece of embedded metal out of the brake pad. In a bike shop, generally they'll take a spoke and sharpen it on a grinder and have act as sort of like a metal toothpick, and they use those on brakes that are worn but not so worn out that you want to throw the brake pad away, that you want to keep reusing it. And so they'll a bike mechanic will actually mechanically dig any little metal that's been embedded into the brake pad out so that you get better braking performance and don't damage your rims. So that's about as exhaustive into brake pads as I think is appropriate for this evening. Does anybody have a question about brake pads before we move on to adjusting cable tension? Okay, well, what I'll say tonight is if you think of any questions after tonight, you can definitely feel free to email them to Dara. She can send them on to me, and I will happily email you back when I have a chance, because I really enjoy answering questions. Okay, so that was sort of one piece of brake maintenance over time, is checking to see whether the brake pad is hitting the rim squarely. Is it sitting too low? Is it sitting too high? Is it towed correctly? And really, you only have to care about towing if your brake pads are squealing or not. And then, is the brake surface worn away? Do you have enough groove left? Is it glazed? Do you need to scuff it up? Do you need to pick out some embedded metal bits? Brake pad maintenance. The other part of brake maintenance is it's caused by the same thing, but you deal with it differently. I'm just looking for, yeah, this one. So as the surface of the brake pad wears away, we mentioned that then as the surface of the brake pad wears away, there becomes more space between the brake pad and the rim. And there's nothing that you can do about that at the brake pad side of things. You can't move that's one adjustment that you generally can't make. I'm going to say generally can't make, not always, but generally can't adjust how far the brake pad goes in and out this way towards the rim. So that adjustment is then made with the cable tension. So if I pull on the cable, I'm going to just do it. If I pull on the cable, what's going to happen is that the brake pads are going to get squeezed in further towards the rim. And as the brake pads wear, I'm going to want to make an adjustment with the cable tension so that the brake pads get squeezed in further towards the rim so that I don't have to pull and pull and pull and pull and pull on the brake lever and then eventually hit my handlebar. You don't want that to happen. So these brakes, because there's no rim in here for the brakes to hit, I can just pull and pull and pull and pull and pull, and eventually the clicking you're hearing is brake lever on handlebar. So if there was a rim in here, that wouldn't happen. I would pull and then it would stop. But as the brake pad wears away, you have to pull and pull and pull and pull further, and you want to be able to adjust that. So there are two places to adjust this. And the way that I like to describe this is if you work with any sort of eyepieces like a microscope or binoculars, you'll have two ways to focus. You'll have a macro focus to kind of get you sort of generally into focus, and then you'll have some sort of micro focus that once you're sort of generally in the focus area, then you can go to the micro focus and really get it dialed in so that things are sharp and you can see them clearly. Same thing happens on brake cables. So the macro adjustment is at the cable anchor pinch bolt that we spoke about earlier. So if I were to undo this cable anchor, it's a tongue twister, the cable anchor pinch bolt, if I were to undo that and let the clamp get loose, then this cable would slide. I could pull it tighter and move the brake pads toward the rim, or I could give it more slack and that would move the brake pads away from the rim. When I'm putting in a new cable, that adjustment is made here at the cable tension adjustment is made at the cable anchor pinch bolt. That's a nice macro adjusting. One reason why you don't want to be using this macro adjustment over and over and over and over is because after you crimp the cable and clamp it really hard with the cable anchor pinch bolt, and it has to be clamped really hard for it to be safe so it doesn't ever slip, that your brake actually works. If this were to slip, then you wouldn't have true braking. So this actually has to really be smashing that cable, which we know is really just a set of wires twisted together. And if we were to undo that and just pull a little bit through and clamp on the same area, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times, you would sever the cable at that spot, and then you would have to get a new cable. So the cable anchor pinch bolt is not a good place to go for every day or every few months or however. It's not an everyday. I was just using every day as an expression, as your sort of go-to adjustment point for your brake cable tension. So this is where brake cable tension gets set up sort of in the very beginning when you're putting on a new cable. But then after that, we like to do the brake cable adjustments at the barrel adjuster. So a barrel adjuster is really just a hollow bolt that you can dial in. And so I'm holding on to the head of the hollow bolt here. And what I'm seeing, there's a little slit in the brake lever right here. And what I'm seeing right here is the bolt inside. So if I were to dial this barrel adjuster out, this is in the loosening direction of the bolt. you'll see a portion of that bolt. There are it's a little bit hard to see on camera, but there are threads right here on this area here that I can then dial back in the righty-tighty direction to make it. So what this is actually doing is telescoping a bolt in and out of the lever. So if you had an old style like rabbit ears antennas, those antennas that you could pull on and pull on to make them grow longer and push in to make them grow shorter, this is what you're doing here by dialing this bolt in and out. But the fact that it's threaded makes it sort of protected so that if I just push on it, if I've made an adjustment, I'll talk about what that adjustment is in a minute so that it's at least makes a little bit of sense to what I'm doing. But when I'm dialing this in or out, the action of untwisting it or twisting it is telescoping it in or out of the brake lever. And so it's protecting it so that if I were to just push it, it won't push in. I have to dial it in. And I have to dial it out. And so that makes it sort of a protected adjustment. What I'm actually doing when I'm dialing this barrel adjuster in or out is, dial it in so I can show you. The end of the cable housing, which I will reiterate is an important part of the brake system. The end of the cable housing goes into the barrel adjuster and sits in a hole in the barrel adjuster, so I can pull it out when it's slack. But what that means is that when I dial this out, what I'm in effect doing, and this will be easier for you to understand when you actually get to do this on your bicycle. So usually at this point in the class, we're all huddled around, we have our bicycles, and we watch me do it once, and then we run over to our own bikes, and we do it. And then it kind of sinks in. But as I'm dialing this out, I am creating space here and pushing on the cable housing and making it so that the effective length, the functional length of the cable housing is increased by however much I've dialed out this barrel adjuster. So it's by about a 1/4 inch right now, which is like pulling on the cable a 1/4 inch. So if I pull on the head of the cable a 1/4 inch, that would be a lot of quite a bit of pull. And so that's a really effective way to make a large cable adjustment. So the way that this works is so this is a bolt, and usually the way that we think of bolts is righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, and this is true for this bolt. So the actual bolt tightens when righty-tighty goes in, lefty-loosey goes out. But the effect that it has on the cable tension is that lefty-loosey dials the bolt out away from the brake lever, creates this space. So lefty-loosey is increasing the cable tension and making the brake pads pull in closer to the rim. And then when I dial it back in, righty-tighty, but for the bolt, it's making the cable more slack. It's introducing less tension into the cable. So I'm pulling on the cable by dialing the barrel adjuster out and letting less tension on the cable when I dial the barrel adjuster in. So the barrel adjuster can sometimes be found in different parts of a braking system depending on the type of brakes that you have, the type of handlebars and brake levers that you have. One thing that's true that can help you find the barrel adjuster on your bicycle if you don't have this exact setup is that the barrel adjuster is going to be somewhere on one end of a brake housing. So the end of the brake housing here goes into the barrel adjuster so that it can push on it. So on this system, this is the barrel adjuster right here. So the brake housing end goes right here. This one is dialed out pretty far, so I'm going to dial it in. And that would make, so let's see if we can actually see this happen. We may or may not be able to, but if you look at the space of the brake shoes or the brake pads, and then you watch me, it might be imperceptible just because of the geometry. Yeah, I would have to have a rim in there. But as I'm dialing this nut, as I'm dialing this bolt out, I am yanking on the cable, in effect. And as I dial it in, I am letting go of the cable and making it looser. So this is how you can make adjustments to your brake cable tension over time as the brake pads wear. So as the brake pads wear, your brakes are going to feel looser, 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 and you can make them tighter, tighter, tighter. The amount that you turn the barrel adjuster, you cannot hurt anything by playing around with your barrel adjusters. So you can turn them several turns in one direction and if you don't remember what I said about dialing it out or lefty-loosey on the bolt tightens the cable, you don't have to have that memorized because you can do it by trial and error. So if this were an actual bike with a rim inside of the brake pads, and I were to dial this barrel adjuster out 3 or 4 full rotations, my brakes would get appreciably tighter, and I wouldn't have to have any guesses about it. And then if I, on the other hand, were to dial this in several turns, so for brake barrel adjusters, several turns, 3 or 4 full revolutions is usually an appreciable difference for the braking system to have it feel tighter or looser. The only reason I'm saying that is because the shifting system works on the same principle. It's a whole different class, but the shifting system works with cables and springs, and there are also barrel adjusters to adjust the shift cable tension, and it's on a different scale. So usually an eighth to a quarter of a turn on the shift cable barrel adjuster, which is found on the shift cable where the shift cable housing meets either a derailleur or your shift levers. That's a different adjustment. So just to note that usually takes 3 or 4 full rotations of a barrel adjuster for the brakes for it to make it tighter or looser. Questions about barrel adjusters or adjusting cable tension on the brakes to adjust your brakes?
I have a question. So if I'm looking at my, where the barrel adjuster is,
yes,
there's 2 moving pieces,
yes,
right? So there's one
yes,
closer to the handle and one further away. So
yes.
It looked like when you were talking about moving it, it was the one further away that is making the adjustment, but does
yes.
the thing in the middle do anything?
Perfect question. Yes. I'm really glad that you asked. So just who is talking? Sorry.
Oh, it's Alyssa.
Alyssa, okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So what Alyssa was pointing out is something that I just patently forgot to talk to you about. I sort of forgot and I sort of left it out, and I'm really glad that you asked about it because I would have wanted to have circled back. I usually try to leave this piece out in the beginning just because it complicates things, but now is the perfect time to answer that question. So thank you for asking that. So Alyssa's absolutely right. On many barrel adjusters on this particular setup, this bolt, the head of the bolt is what I'm turning right now. And what you'll notice, the other piece is actually kind of just spinning along because of friction with it. what Alyssa, I'm just going to dial it out so you can actually see. What Alyssa was noticing is that this piece right here is separate, and it can spin on its own on the threads of the barrel adjuster. What this piece is it's a locking ring. So it does not make any adjustment unto itself. So the way that I make the adjustment is I hold the head of the bolt of the barrel adjuster and dial it out or in. And if I dial it out, what's going to happen over time, everything on a bicycle, because you're riding on an uneven surface, like not perfectly, not everything's like perfectly flat and smooth all of the time. There's a lot of jiggling and wiggling and vibrating on bike frames and all of the parts of the bike. And this is why over time, there are no little gremlins that come and remove small nuts and bolts from your bicycle, but vibration will over time sometimes do that. So sometimes if you have a water bottle cage attached or a rack attached or a fender attached, every so often a little nut or a bolt that's clamping something together on a bike will go missing or become loose over time simply because of a vibration. So threads are a nice way of protecting movement, except vibrationally, I'm going to dial this out so you can see, like over time, this barrel adjuster, because the housing, and this is something that like you either your head's wrapped around this part or it isn't, and it doesn't matter. I'm just going to say it anyway. This part of the housing, because the cable is pulled taut through this curved piece of housing, this bit of housing is actually pushing quite hard into the barrel adjuster. So under vibration, what's going to happen is the barrel adjuster is going to wriggle itself in. And if we want to hold the adjustment, because I just dialed it out several turns and made the cable a little bit tighter, and I want to hold that adjustment over time. And so what I'm now going to do, if I had like 3 hands, I'm going to hold the piece that I just adjusted steady, and I would usually be doing this with 1 full hand, but I'm trying to hold up this piece to show you. And then I will take in my other hand, I will manipulate the locking ring in toward until it's tight. And the reason I have to hold this piece is because if I just do the locking ring at some point, the barrel adjuster will start spinning with it just because of friction. So I'm just going to hold that tight. Dial that out. So as I dialed this out, the lock ring went along with the barrel adjuster. Everything got dialed out. Then I'm going to hold the head of the barrel adjuster and dial that lock ring in to hold that adjustment in place. If, for whatever reason, at some point in time I needed to make the cable, introduce slack into the cable or make it less tight, and I would be doing that by dialing the barrel adjuster in, I can't dial the barrel adjuster in right now until I undo that lock ring, and now I can dial that barrel adjuster in as far as I want. And then I can hold it and then set that lock ring, dial that in separately. So that's a locking ring. It doesn't do any adjusting on its own, but it helps to hold an adjustment that you've made to make the cable tighter in place. Alyssa, does that answer the question?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Great. So that might look different. Okay, that's great. So that might look different on different bicycles. So on this bike system, there isn't a separate lock ring. There is this little separate piece, but it's fixed. And the locking mechanism is just friction. So this just won't slip, because this piece of plastic is creating enough friction on the threads of this bolt that vibration, it's not going to go anywhere. So this is just like a vibrational stop here that is in effect like a lock ring, but you don't have to do anything to it. So this type of barrel adjuster, you would just dial up and down to make the adjustment and not worry about a locking ring. Let me see if I have any other example. That one I don't love, but I will do it if I have to. This one. Yeah, so this one has a locking ring, but it looks really pretty different. So this is a brake assembly that doesn't have that whole other kind of bit that makes it go. But this is where the housing would go in, and this is where the housing would go in, and this is the barrel adjuster right here that I can dial out or dial in, and this is a locking ring, and it doesn't look, it just looks different. It's just a sphere, it's circular, cylindrical, I should say, lock ring. So if I got this dialed out where I want it, then I would just hold the head of the bolt and then dial this locking ring in so that now I can't spin this bolt anymore because this locking ring is hitting the assembly. And if I were to dial that back out, then I could dial this in again a little bit until it locks up again. So this is what you're looking at here, there's a piece of, it's like a metal cylinder lock ring, and instead of having like little ridges that you grasp onto, it has a rubber, what do you call that, gasket, I suppose, or like a rubber O-ring that just provides grippiness so that I can grab onto it and spin it. So there's just different ways of achieving the same outcome on bikes. So the more, you can either get very specific and just look at your own brakes and find out how they work, and that will fit the bill for you. Or if you're more of a generalist associative thinker, you can look at lots of bikes and, from now on, like when you're at the bike rack and you're putting your bike in, you can go like, oh, that's a barrel adjuster, and oh, that's a barrel adjuster, and oh, wow, so they can look pretty different from one another. This is another example of a barrel adjuster, and it's the same as the one that we saw before in theory. It's just smaller. So it's just a small head of a bolt. And then the lock ring looks kind of like a very stereotypical little nut that you would find on any old bolt. That's just another example of a barrel adjuster. So that's how you, over time, adjust the cable tension of your brakes as the brake pads wear. And then anytime you were to have brake pads replaced or cable replaced, then that adjustment you'd need to make again so that they fit together to make it so that you have good braking. Something that people tend to ask in classes past are sort of like, how long do cables and housing last? And again, the answer is a little bit like, they last as long as they last, which isn't usually very satisfying to people. But you can do a physical inspection. So the cable housing, what you don't want to see is any sort of cracking or abrasion, really cracking of the exterior, because once the plastic coating on the housing is compromised, that means water can get in, and that can create a lot of rust and friction. And it also, so it's usually friction between cable and housing that can really wreak havoc on brake. If it isn't simply the brake pads themselves or the brake assembly, if you're having poor braking conditions, oftentimes it's what's going on between the cable and the housing, because there's quite a bit of surface area, especially for rear brakes. So you can do like a visual inspection. I'm just trying to see if I have an example, and I don't really think I do, of like a break housing that's cracked. I don't know that there's one that I could show. And then break cables tend to last a really long time. And it would, again, be sort of doing a visual inspection, just making sure the parts of the break cable that you can see are intact. If the crimp on the end of the break cable comes off, then the cable will fray. The issue with a frayed cable is sort of two-part. One is it'll fray all the way up to where the cable anchor pinch bolt is, and then it might start to break off. The other thing is that a frayed cable, if I can fray it, I have one. These little pieces of cable, if you can see them, maybe kind of sort of, are really sharp. So when they're all twisted together, they're fine. But any one on their own, you can get a really nasty little puncture wound from a frayed cable. So that is sort of the reasoning behind having the ends of the cable, when the cable's been cut to length, having it twisted together, and then putting that little crimpy cap on the end of the cable. If you notice that any of your cables on the bike, whether they're shift cables or brake cables, are missing that little crimp, you can take it to a bike shop and they can replace that for very minimal cost to you. I think we have about 5 minutes left, and I think I've covered what I want to cover material-wise. I've definitely talked a lot. One thing I would love to hear, because this is like the first time that we're doing these, so what I've done is I've taken the class that I usually teach in person and transposed it into me talking for an hour and a half in front of you, which arguably is not necessarily the best way to hold an online educational experience. And so any feedback that you have that you're willing to give via, I think there's a feedback. Dar, what do you do for feedback right now?
At the end of the class, when they get kicked out of the class, they'll be sent to a survey, and there's a place there they can make comments, or they can email me comments, or if they want to tell you anything right now, they can feel free to do that if they want.
So if you can think of ways that I can make this even if it's not the brake class again, but if it's the flat fix class, or how the derailleurs work, or how a hub works inside, those are some of the other topics that get covered in the classes that I teach. If you can think of ways to make it more engaging, more useful for you, more just easier to stay with me, I am all ears, and that's something that I will be working on over time. This shift happened very quickly, and so right now I'm just literally taking the class and like plugging it in to a different format, and I am interested in finding out how to improve this mode of communication, because it seems like we might be here for a little while. One person sent in a question that wasn't about brakes, but was about tire gauges and air pressure. Is that person in attendance? I don't remember who it was, Dar.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me.
That's okay. So that's something that is covered during the flat fix class. So that class will be is usually held. It's the class the September class that I teach, and I'm happy to, if that person comes to another class, we can definitely answer that question. I would need a little more direction on exactly what they want me to explain, but definitely gets covered during the flat fix class, and also I'm happy to answer questions like that one-off during other class times that we have set up.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
This is Anne-Marie. I have a question about the barrel adjuster.
Yes.
You said that you can't really do any harm, and I recently tried to adjust my brakes by fiddling with the barrel adjuster,
yes.
And I was afraid to screw it out too far for fear that, I don't know, that everything would come apart or something.
Okay.
But apparently that won't happen. I can just screw it until it won't move anymore.
Okay, all right. You got me. You caught me. Yes, no, sort of. Okay, so I'm going to try to, in the last minute and a half, I'll try to answer the question. So you can't do any harm to the system, but you could give yourself a big headache by doing that's the only thing that would actually be frustrating. So the system is under tension. Everything's being pulled. So if I were to dial, so what I can see on this style of brake, and I don't know, Anne-Marie, if this is the style of brake that you have.
That's very much like what I have.
So there's this is upside down. It doesn't have to be upside down. I'm just holding it this way because it's easier for me. But there's a slot in the brake lever assembly, which is just, and that has to do with.
Concerned me.
So there's a slot here, and and what that slot allows you to do is see how much of the bolt, of the edge of the bolt is still in. So you can watch, and you want to leave a few threads left in the barrel adjuster in there. If the barrel adjuster comes fully out, it is a real pain in the in the neck.
That's what I was worried about, was that somehow I would disconnect everything, and there I'd be with a bicycle that no longer functioned.
Correct, and that's justified and actually true. So I misspoke. What I was trying to convey was a sense of optimism and the sense of, like, you're not going to wreck your bike and you're not going to hurt anything by fiddling with the barrel adjuster. Go ahead and play with it. The one thing you might not want to do is dial it all the way out so that the bolt comes all the way out. So yeah, you can look in that slot and just make sure, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards, but you can look in that slot and you can see, like, I've left.
Yeah, it looks like you don't have very much left there.
No, not much, but I feel fine. Like, that's fine.
Okay.
But I wouldn't go, it's hard to see, but I wouldn't go much further than that.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yep. No, thank you. Any other questions, either like that or not like that just popped into your head before we say goodbye?
I have one more if nobody else has one. So did I understand correctly that except for when the brake cables are first installed, that you would never adjust them at the I don't remember what you called it, the part
cable anchor, cable anchor pinch bolt?
Yes, that's the one.
So generally, that is the case. If you went from having your brakes brand new, and then you really never played with your barrel adjusters, and you've ridden the bike and they've worn out, your brakes have really worn out, and they're not quite worn to the point where you're going to replace the brakes. So the way that I tried to explain is, like, this is the micro adjuster. So like on binoculars, like if you're using your micro adjuster and you run out of adjustment, then you go back to the macro adjuster.
Okay.
So what I would do over time is this barrel adjuster would get dialed out and out and out and out and out and be pulling on the cable. And at some point I would get to the limit that the first question that you asked.
Yeah.
Once I got to that limit, I can't do that anymore, and I might still have life in my brake pads. So if I wanted to do any more adjusting, what I would then do, and this is going to be my last lesson of the evening, is I would undo the lock ring, dial this most of the way back in, and then go to the cable anchor pinch bolt and yank a little bit of cable through to make them.
And how do you know how much to pull?
You'll watch the brake pads next to the rim. And so if you have...
So there's still some space left so that they're not pushing against the rim. Okay.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. All of these questions come from the pandemic because normally I would just take the bike in and have brakes adjusted, but that's really difficult right now.
It is. Yes, it's true. I think a lot of the bike shops are doing curbside service, so you could call ahead. I am happy that you're inquiring, and I'm happy that you would be attempting to do this and probably be successful. But if for any reason your mode of transportation becomes compromised, a lot of there are bike shops that deliver, there are bike shops that do curbside, so you could just call around and see who's doing that.
Yeah, apparently my regular shop, you have to drop it off, and it's really hard for me to imagine how I would have repairs made without actually talking to somebody.
Yeah, that makes sense too.
That was part of my concern, but also I think it would be really useful for me to know how to do these brake things myself because they come around pretty quickly.
Correct. Yep. Which is that's sort of how we choose the topics. Well, at least this topic is sort of a pragmatic one of.
Anyway, as initial feedback, I found the whole presentation really, really helpful, and I took lots of notes. So I'm going to go and look at all these different things and see if I can make my brakes better.
That's great. That's really nice to hear. I appreciate it.
But I'm good seeing you in person.
Yeah, me as well. And I know different people have different styles of learning, and I know there are different ways to, with this format, I know that there could be something creative I could be doing to be inviting a little bit more, because these are usually hands-on, and I get to sort of watch what you're doing, and you get to watch what I'm doing, and there's a little more back and forth. So I think we're at time.